This is NFA Talk, the show that talks about guns and gun rights, keeping you up to date with what's currently going on, from the newest guns, promotions, and events, plus how we're lobbying for your rights.
All right, it's time for another episode of NFA Talk. I'm your host, Jordan Vandenhoff. Joining me tonight, we got our man in Ottawa, Charles Zach, and we have one of our Atlantic directors, Robert Bracken. So tonight we're talking about the Mass Casualty Committee. And Charles, why don't you start us off and give us a little bit of background, and then we'll get into some of the work that yourself and Robert did for the reports that we've done for them.
Okay. So good evening, everybody. So if anybody doesn't know, the NFA is a formal participant in the Mass Casualty Commission. And for those who don't know what that is, that was formed a couple of years ago by the federal government and the Nova Scotia government in the wake of the mass shooting in Nova Scotia that took place there. So the whole idea of the Mass Casualty Commission is to see, it's got three phases to it. The first phase of what happened. The second phase is why it happened. And then there'll be the third phase of, what can be done to prevent this kind of thing. And there'll be a final phase where they come out with recommendations. They'll be punted back to both the Nova Scotia government and the federal government for review and maybe even put into some kind of policy. So that's the background. Now, I just want to let you know that we got into the fray late, but we did get in. The CCFR was already in there. We lobbied to get in there, and we did it successfully. Shortly afterwards, the Mass Casualty Commissioners told us that because we're the gun orgs or gun lobby, that we'd be forced to work together in a coalition. So we resisted this edict at first, and tried to keep ourselves separate. That didn't happen, so we went on our merry way, accepted the situation, and continued working on this. Now, this in contrast, right? There's over 100 groups that have been that are participants in this process. And if you look at the list, you can go to the Mass Casualty website, and if you go to that list, you'll see that there are a multitude of, especially women's groups, that are looking at this from a gender lens, and there's probably got to be at least 35 to 50 of them. A lot of them are government funded as well. They are not speaking as one voice under an umbrella group or in a coalition. They are talking separately. So right from the get-go, we're being, hamstrung a little bit here. We don't know why. We pleaded our case. It was rejected. We thought it was pretty rational that we speak as separate orgs. We have different perspectives on the matter. But anyway, I belabored the point. So since, last springtime, we've been regularly having meetings with participant meetings, being briefed on the process. So it wasn't until the fall when the hearings started going that we started to really do some constructive work. So, which basically culminated in the second phase. The first phase was, what happened. So we didn't have too much to say there. We were watching it. There's an avalanche of foundation documents pouring into the commission for review. I don't envy their circumstance. It's a lot of information, and it's shifting back and forth. Some of it's misinformation. A lot of it has gaps, and that's why we're there. Bottom line, the NFA is there to guard against any kind of malignment or misinformation that may be bandied about that could be thrown onto our community unjustly. So we are there in the middle of this fray, and we're looking out for you. And we know exactly what's going on. We know what's not going on, and we also know what's going wrong, and also what's going right. So, and we forewarn them that we expect a fair process. We told them why we're there. We told them we're experts in the field, and we want to help. Nobody wants to see this kind of thing repeating itself in the future, right? So we all know that murdering people like this is not normal. Okay, this is not normal behavior, and there has to be some kind of an effective way of doing this. And blaming lawful gun owners and taking away their guns and hoping that this kind of thing will never happen again is fantasy, right? I mean, one of the reasons that this commission started in the first place was because of this mass casualty, and we've had others. But Trudeau was in waiting, already with a list that he wanted to ban. This is according to the Liberals' long-standing civil disarmament agenda. And as soon as it happened, he exploited the situation and banned 1,500 plus so-called military-style assault rifles and whatnot, and then heralded the ban as saying something like, these kind of military-style assault rifles don't belong in Canada, and once again conflated law-abiding, peaceful Canadian firearms owners with these disturbed armed criminals who are causing these things. They are not one and the same. Once again, that's why we're in the commission, to make sure that that narrative doesn't go anywhere here. Now, I can tell you that there's a lot of gun groups out there that are part of, or anti-gun groups that are out there, like the Coalition for Gun Control, that followed us in our briefing on Wednesday, and they want to continue with that narrative, and they really see a grave threat here of the NFA and the CCFR coalition that's in here. So that's kind of the background that got us to where we are. But of course, Robert lives in Halifax, and that's where they're doing the hearings. So Robert was tasked with going to the hotel there to be in person and be our witness there in front of the Mass Casualty Commission. We put together a little brief, and maybe you could, Robert, if you want to get into that a little bit, that'd be fantastic.
Sure. It's actually the Dartmouth side of Halifax, even though we're all called Halifax. But long story short, to go back even before the beginning, after this happened and there was talk about an inquiry, well, first a review and then the push was on for an inquiry. I was very cynical from the start as I've been following it, and I've been following Jordan Bonaparte's Nighttime podcast and author Paul Palango, who used to live in Ontario, but he's been in Nova Scotia for about 20 years, and he's a semi-retired investigative journalist. In fact, I have his latest book, 22 Murders. You probably can't see it. And long story short, even when an inquiry was being called, he had taken to task or mentioned all the weaknesses of it, having a non-adversarial component and then non-disclosure agreements and everything else, and being anything but a public inquiry. And I was very cynical. And then in June, when the 911 tapes, June of last year, were released, that just blew the lid on so many things and put the lie to what the RCMP brass had been saying. But it was about that time when our former president, Sheldon, told us that, okay, we were being invited. So he tasked me with writing a report, and I slaved over it for a few weeks in June and July and came out with our Mass Casualty Commission report, which I pretty much left unaltered, except a couple of months ago I put end notes in it. And even though I'd written it 7 months ago, it was still, I chose not to change it because it was every bit as relevant. And when I read it, I left out the first part, which was basically outlining the history of gun control, especially during the last 5 decades. And I felt no need to, because our good friend Blake Brown had done that. So what I wanted to do was go, it was broken into, I think, 5 parts. I wanted to go over several other parts, which emphasized mendacity for politicians and some pushback and differing opinions, including the coroner's conclusion in the wake of École Polytechnique and whatnot. So I had to jump around a bit, and I had to manage my time. But so it was challenging, which is why it seemed a bit unwieldy to anyone who was watching and not knowing what I was doing, even though I was, the commissioners themselves had seen the report. So I would reference what page I was on and what report, because I jumped from our report to Dr. Gary Mauser's comments on Brown's report, and into finally requesting that Dr. Langman be subpoenaed to present his paper, his most recent paper, titled Mass Homicide by Firearm in Canada, Effects of Legislation. So that was a bit of work to just try to shape that into 10 minutes and then have enough time to entertain questions, which of course they didn't ask me.
No, and a fine job you did, Robert.
Thank you.
There's and you touched on some elements here, the Langman study and Gary Mauser's rebuttal. So I just want to highlight why Gary was commissioned by us to write this paper. Blake Brown, who's a notorious anti-gun civil disarmament activist, and he's dropped off the grid on Twitter and elsewhere. We don't know why, but anyway, we know him well. We knew what kind of things that he liked to say. And we were shocked when we heard that the Mass Casualty Commission actually commissioned him to write a paper on guns because it knew it was
Right.
going to be biased.
And Charles, you know what's really interesting about that? When he got accepted, his Twitter magically disappeared.
Exactly. Right.
And why is that? Because he might have had some stuff on his Twitter that would have discredited him, right?
Well, I'll tell you this. So that both Rod and I, we complained vehemently to the commission that Blake Brown was commissioned to do this report, and we were not being commissioned to write a counter report. Okay? And we said that here's all the reasons. He is biased, he's anti-gun, he's unfair, and he peddles a lot of misinformation. And we punted that right back to the commissioners, and maybe he caught wind of that, I'm not sure, and deleted his Twitter accounts to, I guess, cover up the evidence. But anyway, we received this thing, and it was exactly as expected. It was called The History of Gun Control. I'm just summarizing here, but basically, actually, it was a very well written chronology of gun control history in Canada, right? And it basically showed the evolution of where we are now. One thing that he failed to actually do was highlight the fact that none of these measures, or none of these legislation, none of these laws, gun prohibitions, or anything else had any effect on crime control, abating mass shootings and domestic violence, suicide, and other things like that. So it was a great little list of things, but that's all it was. And that's why we commissioned Gary to write something, and he's very happy to do this. And he's actually rebuked Brown's work before in previous papers, so he was more than happy to do this. He had all this information at his hand and submitted this thing. And if you go to the commission, it's basically under the file is COMM0056193. It's officially in the foundation documents for review. So that's formally there for the commissioners to see. But just to summarize, he looks at the work and then congratulates Blake for the chronology of things that he did. And in his conclusion, he says that this is all fine and dandy, but none of these things were effective in stopping anything, gun ban or anything like that. So it was a great little retort to that.
Perfect. So Robert, when you presented yesterday, was Blake there as well presenting?
No, not at all. He even on the day before, they had that duo from Santa Barbara, Travis Bridges, I think, or forget, and I think I got his first name wrong, and the other person, and I don't think even they presented. I think someone presented on their behalf, so we didn't even have them. So Brown didn't present Tuesday, and he wasn't there yesterday. The only person I saw yesterday I knew was Brian Carter, who's I sat at his tape. I got there very early, just after 8, and he's been taking this in for months. He's a retired Mountie, president of the Veterans Association, and a fellow IPSC shooter. And although we don't agree on a lot of things, we're friends. But he left before I presented. Now, on a side note with Brown, yes, the elimination of his Twitter account is quite suspect. And I remember his book Arming Disarming Canada came out in 2012, I think, and I bought it. And I remember reading Gary's review first, and I actually used his book as a centerpiece of a presentation I gave over at Tons in I think in 2013 when I was regional coordinator. So I was quite familiar with his work. And in his book, on several times he refers to gun owners as emasculated middle-aged white men. And I think some of that carried over to A.J. Somerset's work about the credo of guns. And that was a book that wasn't worth buying. So when I finished it, I think I mailed it to Gerald Lundgaard so that he wouldn't have to waste his money on it. He still has it.
Right.
I just want to get back to these witness things. Okay, so let's just backpedal a little bit. So originally, I had the idea of getting Gary to submit a commission paper to the Mass Casualty Commission. They rejected that, and they rejected it because they said that his empirical peer-reviewed studies are dated. Okay, that's not the way it works. There is no expiry date on truth. It can be refuted or it can be amended based on peer review and scientific study, but you can't just say it's expired. No. So, and that's why we couldn't get him to actually do a commission thing. But we also tried to get Dr. Langman, who has already come up with some papers before, actually empirical studies, talking about exactly the same thing. And he too was rejected as a witness because they called his work not germane to the discussion at hand. Well, he talks about guns, gun control, its ineffectiveness on stopping this kind of thing. How much more germane can you be? So, I remember having a discussion with Dr. Langham about this, and he was incensed. Okay, that's putting it mildly. And he wanted to send out something to everybody. And I said, just relax. We're going to play this smart. So I said, why don't you write another paper and, prove them wrong? He goes, I'll do better than that. I'm going to write a study. And he did. So this study is now, it's being peer reviewed. I think it's already peer reviewed now. It's supposed to be peer reviewed in May. But basically, and we got this into the commission. It is, where is it now? It's called the Mass Homicide by Firearms in Canada Effects of Legislation. And that is COMM 056196. And those were both his and Gary's paper were submitted before Robert's presentation as formal exhibits. So those are now formally before the Mass Casualty Commission. So that's kind of interesting about these two witnesses, how they tried to shut that down. More suspect treatment of us, right? We're not seeing this from the other side. We're seeing, the anti-guns trot out these people with the same old pontifications, if I want to put it that way, that are not, they're unsubstantiated. It's not based on any empirical evidence. It's all on belief, but there's no facts, right? So we have facts, they don't.
And two quick notes there, Charles. Anybody can find this simply by Googling Mass Casualty Commission, and they can go on their website. And the other thing, again, just rehashing a bit, I was very cynical, and Paul Palango had noted this. And in fact, I noted this on page 1 or page 2 of our report. I said this commission looks as if it's going to be usurped by certain women's groups and special interest groups, and they're trying to drive it toward two things: an issue of more gun control and gender-based violence. And if the facts are allowed to come out, that's not at the core, that's at the periphery. It's about two things. It's about the failure of the critical incident response, and about the alleged relationship that Workman may have had as a confidential informant, and his long extended career criminal background, aside from his work as a den tourist. And
Robert, you've been following the Palango stuff. I've been following the formal documentation and everything else, and we're both getting the same kind of thing, that this system is a little wrong. There's something wrong here.
That's right.
And maybe you can talk to that, Robert.
Well, again, just the people lobbied and protested, I think, in front of one of the MLA's offices, or it may have been in front of Provincial Justice Minister Mark Fury's office, or then Premier Steve McNeil. Long story short, they agreed to have a public inquiry, but it's been anything but, with closed only sessions, non-disclosure agreements, payouts, and the whole 10 meters. But and of course, having Wuhan COVID and these mandates hasn't helped at all. It's only hurt. And of course, there's no adversarial component. At one point, they had 3 police officers who were among the first responders interviewed as a panel instead of one at a time. And I mean, they still had, and they hadn't been interviewed earlier on and the idea of foundational documents. And Palango laughed at that and asked, well, what are they trying to do? Redo the Magna Carta or the Declaration of Independence? What does that mean? And then that whole concept of trauma informed. Now, when I went in there yesterday, Brian, early on in, my friend who's a retired Mountie, said around here they don't use his name, that Gabriel Wortman, that they, just as out of respect for some of the families of the victims who were there. But I understand that from one perspective, not to give the murderer any more infamy. But if you do that, if you think about it for any length of time, what you end up doing is you defer blame from an individual, and that leaves so many questions open. We should know who this person was and why they did what they did. The same as when I talk about École Polytechnique, I talk about Gamil Garbi because that was his given name. And of course, we learned shortly after that his father was an Algerian national who was a misogynist of the first order. And even Gamil's mother, a few years later, had an interview with the CBC, I think in the early to mid-90s, and talked about his horrible life, which of course was no justification, but at least gave you some background.
Part of the things that I'm hearing on my end, right, I mean, we all hear about how the RCMP kind of dropped the ball on this. I mean, this guy went around for 2 days. 2 days. There was radio things, and of course, the confusing part about this that he was impersonating a policeman. I get that, but they knew that. So he was running around for 2 days, murdering people, not just with guns, but with gasoline. Okay, so this is not just about guns. This is about murder. And the intent to do so.
Well, incendiary grenades, we understand, and
Yes.
and I remember early on in Palango talked about the Freedom of Information requests, and their words blacked out
Yes.
because of those fires, the way they burned so intensely. Those weren't ordinary fires; they
Yep.
were possibly the incendiary grenades. Where did he get them?
Well, this
Right.
guy had a lot of stuff, right? I mean, we're seeing that from the firearms report. And I think that's only part of it because we're not sure whether or not this is the stuff that he actually used or had in possession that they found. And there's a lot of things in there that, well, most of them are prohibited.
Yeah,
And they're
just
all brought over from the States. They're smuggled in. They're all prohibited devices. Even the full capacity magazines that, that everybody's harping on these days. But, he is the perfect model of why gun control doesn't work, especially when it's focused on peaceful, law-abiding people. Because the law-abiding people, yes, they will comply because they're law-abiding, but these criminals, these wanton criminals, by definition, will not obey the law. And look at the carnage that they've caused. The guns are inconsequential. He was a nutbar, right? Intent on doing harm, and that's what he did.
And on two quick notes, well, actually, get a three. One is that in Glenholm, we know now about Adam Fisher defending himself with a shotgun and issuing a threat to Wortman, who left, and of course, what was I going to say? There's also the persistent rumors about Wortman being a confidential informant, as Palango put out. Palango was very versed in RCMP culture, having written 3 books, but he also referenced something that happened a week before. There was a major biker bust in New Brunswick. And that was Wortman's stomping grounds, or where he was originally from. And what happened? Did he feel he was something was about to fall in on him? And then, of course, I lost my train of thought here.
No, but you're right about the RCMP thing, Robert. Like I'm hearing that too.
Well, the cover up.
Yeah, people are calling me from that area, reiterating exactly what you just said. And we all know this. Like, I mean, I've been around long enough now. A lot of these, these biker gangs used to be in urban centers, but they're run out of town, and they went to the urban places because it's more protected. Okay,
but we have them in the rural areas too, as Palango.
Yes,
getting back to that, had highlighted the Porter Pick area and that part up to Parsboro and Spring Hill, where coincidentally we have a federal penitentiary. But getting back to the RCMP's coverage of it, they've been pulling teeth to try to get information. They've had the union involved, trying to keep police officers from testifying. Today, you had the two police officers, Brown and Melanson, who shot up the Onslow Fire Hall. And Palango did a study on that. It's quite interesting about the geography around there and a great big hedge, which prevents you from seeing something until you're on top of it. I could talk about that later. But in particular, too, in Palango's book, briefly in chapter 6, it's one of the 2 chapters I've read. It's only 11 pages long, but it's titled A Mountie Dies. And the eye and ear witness accounts that he covers, it only highlights the collision where Wortman drove into Constable Stevens' vehicle and disabled it. And there were only a few gunshots heard, and they were probably all from Wortman. And there's been no evidence presented that she fired any rounds, because I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was a report that she had fired up to 14 rounds, which is almost a mag dump. And the witnesses that we've read about in the book, that doesn't jive with that. She was probably disabled upon collision, whereupon he killed her and then stole her service pistol.
So like you said, we're still early in the process. We've gone through phase 1 that explored why. There's gaps everywhere, and more information keeps flooding in, right? But you touched on a very important piece here, that we know that there's this confidence agreements that are out there with core witnesses. They have important information that is not part of the foundation documents yet, and may never be. Now, just so you understand, the Mass Casualty Commissioners can only rule and consider the information that's in the foundation documents. If it's not there, they can't speculate, they can't make up stuff. They will rule on what's there or what's not there, right? So that's an important piece.
And that's another point, Charles, the commissioners. I mean, Paul Palango even pointed out the makeup of the commission. with Leach, who's a former police chief who has close ties to the Mounties, Michael McDonald, a retired judge who was a Reagan appointee and or a Liberal appointee, and Kim Stanford, who is a social justice lawyer who has publicly stated she's more interested than social progress or re-engineering than the truth. And I can tell you one thing, as someone who's been cynically following this, but trying to learn as much as he can since day one, there is a world of difference between where we're at and what we discuss and actually being at a commission presentation. It's just it's almost surreal. A lot of polite people, a lot of formality, and a lot of sort of unspoken taboo. And it was almost surreal being there.
You know, and you're right to be skeptical. I mean, we have lots of examples out there. Recently, we got a so-called report from SECU, the public safety study that came out, and I did an analysis of that, and it was no big surprise. This is what the Liberals do. There was some good stuff in there, about talking about, going to the, preempting things before, young people get their hands on guns and get into gangs and commit murder. Okay, but then there's a whole chapter where they go into gun control and trying to rationalize it as being some kind of effective crime control measure, and it's not, right?
They did the same. Yeah,
but that was actually put in there, right, by the majority of that committee, which is Liberal, right? Mm-hmm. Not because it made any sense, but this is the way they slide things in. So, as you said, one of the commissioners has been appointed by Trudeau onto this commission. Or actually, it was by the Liberal government anyway, right? So, I expect the same kind of shenanigans to happen there. We can line up all the ducks we want, the empirical evidence, the rationale, the logic, and everything else, and whatever it is. But in the end, right, the recommendations, I fear, are going to be corrupted by politics.
And we saw the same thing with the Guns and Gangs Summit. I mean, they did actually discuss gangs, but ultimately we knew the way this government works, it was going to get back to focusing on guns.
Yes.
Now, in this commission makeup, it could have been even worse because they almost put Landslide Annie, a.k.a. Anne McClellan, in there.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, almost.
Yes. So that's why we're there again. We're on guard. We're watching this. And we've made it plain. We have a representative, a council representative, that we're watching. I'm taking notes. Anything that comes out that isn't kosher is being duly noted. And if we do see that we're going to be unfairly maligned in the end here, and the policies are going to come out with more gun control just because we happen to have guns like this other maniac did, we're part of this process, right? So our voices are going to be loud and clear. Jordan's going to make sure that our message gets out into the wild there, and people will know that this is nothing more than another sham, right? So if you're watching out there, you've been warned.
Right. So, Robert, let's go back to your actual presentation. Now you went about eight minutes long, and you left yourself some time for questions, and they kind of hesitated. It's like they had questions, but what's your take on that? Like, did they not want to? Because they knew you knew what you were talking about. Is that why they didn't want to go with the questions, or what was your feeling on that?
My feeling is either they knew that I knew what I was talking about, or they just didn't want to ask questions, or the thought was maybe, how quickly can we get this idiot off the stage, referring to me? Because, again, I didn't cover Blake's spiel or what he had covered about the history of gun control. So I jumped into just a few notable things, well, which I can repeat if you want, but just briefly, why didn't they ask me questions? Why keep somebody on stage any longer when they're not delivering the confirmation bias that you want? And I'm pretty sure that all three councillors are on par with listening to the Coalition for Gun Control for as long as they want.
So you weren't part of their narrative. So let's get him in, let's get him out, give him his chance. So you were there live. What was the atmosphere there? Like, were you the guy that was, hey, he's from the gun lobby, everybody ignores you, or was it open conversation when you were there?
Well, I spoke to, as I say, I had an amiable chat with Brian, who's a fellow IPSC shooter, even though we have different opinions on things. And I sat at his table for a couple of hours. And just briefly, it was a sort of an open conference type room at the hotel. Media were at the back. There were about a dozen media. Then there were some family members interspersed. And then toward the front, there were some tables with some federal lawyers. And then there was the stage and the podium off to one side. And there were the commission counsel and a witness table. But yeah, it was no discomfort. People were polite and smiled. There was some security there, and I didn't talk to too many people. But as I say, I think people knew who I was as I was about to present. I had a little no compromise pin, but I don't know if anyone noticed it because I had my hair down, which I usually don't.
Right. So okay. So for everybody that's tuning in, what's the next stage here? What's the next stage for you?
I just want to say this, just to finish up what happened at the end of that day. Okay, so after we presented, the Coalition for Gun Control presented theirs, and they had their lawyers stand up, and the first thing she said or tried to say to the commission was that the NFA, this coalition of an NFA and CCFR, they're trying to discredit us, and all the papers and the studies that we had submitted and the witnesses that we called or going to call, because they didn't want that information to go into the next round, which is coming up, which is the roundtable part. So for those who don't understand what a roundtable is, it can be many different things. It can be a formalized thing where people present, nothing but empirical studies, and you compare the studies and come up with some kind of a conclusion at the end. This is nothing like that. So yes, there'll be studies that'll be presented. There'll be things opinionated. The beliefs that will be bandied about as well too. So it's going to be a free fall. This dialectic exchange of all ideas. Hopefully, in the end, we'll come to some kind of understanding of the truth. I'm not sure what semblance of truth that's going to be, given that it's not regulated. Will they accept an opinion as valid evidence? That's kind of flawed already, right? So, especially in the face of empirical evidence like what we're going to present. So, the coalition, the Gun Control Coalition, I can see they're a little worried here that we're entrenched in this thing, because they're used to having a monopoly on the narrative, and that's why they've come so far. So, and that's why we're there, right? To make sure that there's balance in the presentation of information, and there's fairness in the process, and hopefully some kind of valid and reliable conclusion and recommendations at the end. So the future, what's going on here now is that in another week or two, we're going to start getting into the roundtable. So this is our opportunity to, once again, Robert, you may want to partake. Hopefully I can get Dr. Langman to come in as a witness, or at least participate in some of these roundtables that are coming up. I'll be participating in the roundtable. So that is what's coming up next. So that's what you got to look forward to.
Very good. All right, so yeah, we've been going for about 30 minutes. I think we'll leave it at that. We'll probably come back when we have another update. Again, Charles, Robert, thank you so much for what you guys are doing with this. And until next time, everybody that tuned in, thanks for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of NFA Talk. Like and follow the NFA on social media and sign up to become a member.